Welcome. I'm Dr. Paul VanValin, and this is about the 13th or 14th in a series of online webinars we've been conducting. And for the next hour, I will be presenting on leading through common stress. We've been doing a series on using the metaphor of the Good Shepherd from John 10, and this is another one in that series. This will be played on YouTube, and so for individuals that might view this that don't know me, a brief introduction. Raised by a preacher and his wife, son of a preacher, lots of preachers in my family. So working with leaders in the faith is very important to me personally. And as a result of that, I've had the privilege of counseling and coaching leaders both in the marketplace and in ministry for many years. And brings great satisfaction. So what we do is combine scripture and principles of the Christian faith with social science, given that I'm a clinical psychologist, and then illustrative stories to hopefully provide some value, content and experiences, and today handouts and online references for further research that I hope brings value to you. This is part of Eden Leaders Institute, and we exist to help you develop your family, your community, and to live a life that leaves behind something of high value. This event is every third Thursday at noon Eastern Time, and YouTube can be searched for previous training. So today's objective is to understand stress, stressors. These are terms we'll define, and to be able to have resources to evaluate our own lives and our own function as leaders, and begin to conceptualize, if we need to make changes that will really help us personally so that we can be authentic leaders, helping other people through common life stress. Next month, we're going to talk about critical stress, those events that are bigger than normal everyday events. A simple definition of stress is in the way we respond to stressors. Stressors is a noun, and it describes the circumstances, situations, events that we have to adapt to. Change equals stress is one way of looking at this. Every time we have to change, whether it's a small change, I had to readjust my schedule because my vehicle wouldn't start, or big change such as there's a hurricane coming through our neighborhood and we need to get out of town. It requires resources from us. One of the metaphors that I use, if you could picture this, I'm not on screen, is in my right hand I'm holding a sphere that's glowing, and it's an image of all the energy that I possess, my psychological, spiritual, physical, social, relational energy. And every breath I take, I apologize for coughing. It's allergy season for me, and I cough when I talk, so I have a cough drop in my mouth, and I'll try to manage this. But every breath I take, every thought I think takes a little bit of energy. And my left hand is a container. Mine's just a crude wooden bowl with a little spigot. That's my stress bowl. And every time I have to adapt to something, or every time something unexpected happens, a little bit of stress goes into the bowl, or a lot depending on the circumstance. And the goal is to have energy left over in my right hand. And so I have to know what replenishes my ball of energy, what rejuvenates, what puts me in recovery. And in my left hand, what reduces my stress? How do I turn that spigot and drain it? For when that bowl is full and overflowing, then I'm manifesting something that is not good for me and those around me. Stress is cumulative, it adds up. One of the things I do with little children is I'll take blocks, and we will stack these blocks one at a time, describing events of the day or the week. And so one block is I was late for school, another block is my brother and I had a fight, another block is my mother was unhappy with me because I didn't eat my peas. And so these blocks eventually stack up until it falls over, and the child gets it. Okay, so these things add up, and eventually bad things happen. So one of my metaphors, along with the energy ball and the bowl of stress, is the chain link. So if you can picture a large chain, links of a chain, each link has a label for something in you: lungs, heart, muscles, skin, emotions, faith, relationships, ministry role. And we see a big hand on either side of this chain, and every stressor that occurs, a little tug or a big tug, and if there's time to recover, the chain goes slack. But if there's not time to recover, these things just add up until there's a crack in the chain, the weak link, so to speak. The stress shows up in the weak link of the chain. In myself, I'm in my 7th decade, so I've been learning a lot about weak links all along. And I have a slight curvature of my spine, I have a slight misalignment of my hips, and that results in my left leg being just a little bit shorter than my right leg, and my body having a tendency to be out of alignment. And I can end up with headache, neck, back, shoulder pain. I was told when I was 22, I volunteered to be a control subject, meaning someone who didn't have pain in a pain study when I was in the Army. So this friend of mine says, well, you should have tons of back pain. And I said, well, I don't. I guess I was naive and ignorant, and my denial remains. I still don't have back pain, though my chiropractor tells me I should have back pain. So what I've had to do is adapt some things to avoid back pain, and managing my stress, doing things with my shoes, wearing certain shoes, doing certain exercises, stretches. There are things we can do to mitigate or reduce stressors that even are sitting on the brink of just emerging at any time. So I know when I have a headache, I've probably earned it. I haven't taken care of myself. I haven't managed my stress or my body position well enough. And I don't see myself as victimized because I've learned what I can do to help prevent and alleviate stress when it occurs. And one of the critical themes is recovery. And this is a beginning basic Bible 101 kind of principle. We read in Genesis 2 and 3, by the 7th day God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the 7th day he rested from all his work, which is an interesting concept that either God is just showing us what we need or he actually does this himself. I mean, I'd leave that up to you theologians to wrestle with that one. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So God is the example, and this is carried over again in great detail of the 10 Commandments. This one and 3 have the greatest number of descriptors, elaborators, trying to make it crystal clear what this means. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. Pretty big job here. God had the big job, the sea and all is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, depending on your theological view of what the 10 Commandments are, this one, if you talk to many young pastors, will say, well, it isn't really relevant today. And I disagree based on all the stuff I'm going to show you. So Jesus practiced recovery. And we see this 9 times in the New Testament. If I'm just using the NIV as my word search. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. So this comes up several times, very, very clearly. Matthew 15:21, leaving that place, and he had just had a big confrontation in that place, he withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and there he meets the woman at the well, and he's alone. He's alone. And then Luke 5:16 kind of summarizes this. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So the word Jesus withdrew 9 times as translated by the NIV. So we have this concept where Jesus, after his work, whether it's teaching or healing, he withdraws. And part of his recovery was communication with his Father, the source of his strength, prayer. So back to our metaphor of the Good Shepherd. We read in John 10 that he sleeps at the gate to protect the sheep. So he puts himself at risk, which good leaders often do. And so David, as a shepherd, he literally was a shepherd when he reports that he killed a bear, killed a lion, which are topics we probably would address next month. And the good shepherd makes all kinds of decisions, solves all kinds of problems, has to get others to follow him, has to find the lost sheep, lives in terrible conditions, and is responsible for the quality, the stability, the maintenance of the sheep to the owner. All metaphors that relate to Christian leaders. So David is an interesting life when it comes to looking at stress. I mean, he experienced war, he started war, he ended war, he killed, he was threatened himself, He committed adultery. He experienced those that loved him abandoning, betrayal. And so then the glimpses of recovery we get from a very creative man like David, he took the time to write and to create poetry, to sing songs. He spent time with his friends. He was a lover of many things, which sometimes got him in trouble. Worship was very important. He was creative, and he was a unifier. So I think sometimes our work is so fulfilling that it rejuvenates us. But unfortunately, because it's work, there are things that we do that are not rejuvenating. So these are just snippets of life from one particular shepherd who carried that metaphor all the way to being in a position of king. So in terms of just understanding types of stress, here are 3 types of stress. Critical stress, which we'll talk about next month. And these are acts of God or man-made that are terrible, that in anyone would stir huge need for adaptation. You know, when we have a hurricane that blows through and certain parts of our community are without power for an hour to 2 weeks, it interrupts life. It's stressful. And acts of humanity are considered worse because of the intentionality, because of sort of just how it goes against the grain of how people should be, how society should be. So we're going to talk about this next month, how to cope with yourself and lead people through critical stress. Stressful life events is more the topic of today. And some of them are really tragic: death, loss of income, illness, vacations, having to move. And so you'll see in the Holmes-Ray scale, both positive and negative stress add up. Daily hassles are those smaller things that can make or break a particular day or week or month. If they get strung together too much, now we're into, distress. So the Holmes-Ray test, we actually set out by email. Give me just a second. I'm gonna have to adjust what I show on the screen here, and I'm gonna have to blink through a couple here. Here we go. So the Holmes-Ray test is research-based. You can take mine and use it, make copies of it. It's not copyrighted. I've been using this for decades, literally. And they took the simple concept of rating events that happen to people with numbers, and then you add up the numbers. And if something happened twice, I go ahead and double it. So you can see the death of a spouse is 100. Now the reason that is right at the top is, in a traditional marriage where we become one flesh, our identity is shattered when one of us dies. The survivor, the number of adjustments one has to make in a healthy, loving marriage are innumerable, affecting all aspects of life. And then as you go down, divorce is next, and marital separation. So you can see that intimate relationship carries some of the highest values. And this was made, decades ago. If they were to create it today, maybe other things would be at the top. But this still holds true for people of my generation who see themselves as one flesh when they marry. And then you go through the list, and you'll notice you get near the bottom, and there are vacation. Well, my goodness, why would you get stress points for a vacation in Christmas? Well, the reason being, one of my favorite phrases is, you pay for your vacation before and after. So I just got out of Thanksgiving. I took a week, went to see my father. I have family coming in. Next week, I'm going to work and have family visiting. Thursday, I fly to Tulsa to be with my own nuclear family. And so the in-between time right now, I am just working like crazy. I'm paying for the time I did take off and time I will take off. So we actually increase stress as we're trying to de-stress. That's just a reality of life. And so what we do is we go through the last 12 months thinking, which of these items apply to me? We add them up. We end up with a score of low, moderate to high. I always score high. Many of you will also. I'm an entrepreneur. I run a business. It's a small business. Everybody's life affects everybody else. It's almost like family. So if one of my admin staff gets sick, there's not an immediate replacement. We just have to all work harder. And so many of you who run small organizations understand this, and even large organizations. In fact, sort of the larger the staff, the more headaches you could have as you deal with the realities of life. So this is the Holmes-Ray scale. We sent it to you. We can send it again if you need to see it. And in my own, I actually scored low this year, 374 to 400. Depending on how often you count changes in work activity in the last 14 months. I went 14 months just to make this illustrative because my house flooded September of 2015, a plumbing error. So we had to move in and out within a 2-month time frame, which was a big deal. They emptied my house of furnishings and moved it all back in a short period of time. I was my own contractor, and I'm overseeing the job, and I'm running Eden, and I essentially lost it felt like I lost 3 months of what I would consider valuable creative time. It had to all go to just sustaining life at Eden and my house. So I extended 2 months just to tell this story of that could happen to anybody, where life just gets suspended, but it really boosts the stress points. So let's. I see don't have the view here, right? There we go. So I want to talk a little about clergy. Most of our viewers are clergy and spouses of clergy, and there's a huge study, and I cite some important references at the end of this PowerPoint, which you'll be able to observe on YouTube to get these references. But there's a study at Duke University. It's called the Clergy Health Initiative, and a single donor donated multiple millions of dollars to Duke University to study. It was very specific. They had to study North Carolinian United Methodist pastors. So these are pastors living in North Carolina. Obviously, that's where the donor came from. And stress and its impact on health, both physical and emotional. So this is the biggest study ever conducted. It's got a 10-year longevity. They're about halfway into it. And so their website has just a lot of resources, interesting blogs, publications, discussion of how they came about creating their instrumentation, ideas, tips, really, really good stuff. So one of the things I always want you to get out of the time you spend with me are opportunities to go deeper into what we're talking about. So intrapersonal means within the person. These are stressors that pastors experience, from emotional exhaustion, burnout, working too hard, too long, a mindset that has become negative because of struggles, and then health struggles that we'll talk about that are germane to the pastorate, at least as measured by United Methodist pastors in North Carolina. Now, this may or may not generalize to your population, but most of the places that I present this, people say, yeah, that probably applies to us too. So the pastoral family has unique family stressors that yield sometimes lower family satisfaction than the general population. And that has to do with time and commitments, living a public life versus private. So your dirty laundry is kind of out there for all to see sometimes. Boundary ambiguity means, well, when do I stop working? When is it work and when is it not work? And which friends of mine are friends and which are colleagues and constituents, and then your family being criticized by all these observers. So those are some common family stressors for pastors. Social stressors have to do with expectations. Again, criticism. Even the most callous of us struggles at times when negative information just keeps coming our way, and people will complain about what seem like most trivial things with great passion. Why'd you change the lighting? Why, we used to do it this way. Why are you doing that? But the biggest issue is a lack of social support. Richard Gardner has a tremendous book. I recommend it to everybody, called Leading Minds. This just came to mind, so it's not in my resources. But he just starts out by saying that leadership is lonely. You're at the top. And he talks about the reality of that in the beginning of his book. And that's so true. Leaders have to be very intentional about building social support. So vocational stressors, depending on where you work and with whom you work. My father certainly was in a denomination where pay was not high at all. We were in a state of technical poverty all of my life as a minor, living at home. Unfortunately, there's this mix of high satisfaction and low satisfaction among pastors, and the low work satisfaction is really low. And some denominations relocate, so that's challenging. And it's a complex job, which is why some people like it. I mean, you really have to do lots of different things to be an effective pastor, particularly of a small church. It's required. So some of the research from the Duke study shows that pastors have a good long life in terms of years. And they engage in less risk behavior, which contributes to it. But certain things, coronary disease and diabetes, they have more of than non-clergy people of the same age. They're at greater risk, at least in North Carolina, for obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, arthritis, and asthma. And all of these conditions are affected by stress. And the obesity contributes greatly to the other ones, if you look at this. So the inflammation that's often created by the diet or exacerbated by the diet of people who are eating too much is a direct contributor to heart disease and blood pressure. And there's a direct correlation between high blood sugar and being overweight. And then metabolic syndrome, I'm not going to get into in great detail, but it has to do with weight and body mass, and there are optimal measures, and clergy often are out of bounds with that. And I actually have a nice website by the National Institute of Health that you can go to and read more about that in the resources. So all of these things exist for clergy. Now, many clergy are less physically active than they should be. They're visiting people, they're sitting and writing, they're sitting and studying, and they have, the work week can be 7 days if they're not carving out a Sabbath, because Sunday's not a Sabbath for pastors. And because of busyness, or they just really don't have a theology of health, which is true of some old-timey folks. I see younger leaders often really eating well, living well, setting boundaries. So I think there's forward progress in some circles with this. And just the nature of stress, which we're talking about here. If you're constantly in stress, your body is there's too much adrenaline going on, and that results in cortisol in the brain, which can actually contribute to the desire to overeat. So you have a vicious cycle of stress and unhealthy, or just to be quickly judgmental, bad behavior leading to bad outcome. Now, this isn't necessarily everybody's story, and I'm not trying to freak anybody out with this. It's just we should pay attention to this. We need to help our colleagues, help ourselves, and move forward positively. So depression is higher in clergy. Part of that is temperament, and part of that is stress. And so the depression is more manifest. So depression is like multi-determined: mood, appetite, sleep, sexual energy, thought processes, negativistic thinking. And the physical symptoms are more likely to show up in clergy. So they need to pay attention to their bodies, because it can tell us something about our minds. And depression and burnout are closely related. So when we're depressed, we actually separate ourselves because of shame associated with the depression. So that leads to this disenfranchisement in the last bullet. And some of the contributors are being exposed to various grief experiences as we minister, and also trauma. They can contribute to our depression. And I see my slide didn't make it. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize this one had. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, men and women may differ because of physiological and brain differences, with men being more active. They're more irritable, they're more withdrawing, maybe more addictive, pursuing. Women expressing their feelings more. Men being more irritable and angry, and so sometimes we have to diagnose depression for a male leader. He's not in touch with the feelings associated with that, doesn't see it. And this could be true of either gender, but it does happen to run in a stereotype. Clergy have a lower rate of chronic anxiety, but they may have higher state or situational anxiety. That's what trait and state is. Trait is like within the character of the clergyman. Many clergy are really pretty cool people. They're pretty laid back, many, but they may be reactive to the stressors. And some of the same stuff that leads to depression leads to anxiety. So one of the tips for dealing with both anxiety and depression is to see the self as not entirely encapsulated by the job. I'm not a pastor, but I'm a psychologist and a business leader. So my success at Eden does not define my value. Now, it's taken me 5 decades to figure that one out. So it's not always easy. So what do clergy do that's addictive? Well, unfortunately, most studies argue that clergy engage in sexual misconduct at a very high rate, and including engagement in pornography. Food has long been a socially sanctioned addiction, food and caffeine, socially sanctioned. The whole concept of negative leadership, negative religiosity can be a form of compulsion. And with today's activities, besides pornography, various media components can become rather compulsory. Watching television to escape, engaging in all kinds of online activity that is not necessarily fulfilling, life enhancing, or promoting health. So, what do we do about all this stuff? Well, we need to continue dialogues such as this, where we can talk openly about these realities. We need to educate ourselves. So I would encourage you all to go to the Duke website and just read and ponder this. Talk with your colleagues and friends. We need to help people feel that it's okay to complain about certain things, and then we need to see. This is a simple concept that I really believe. We can't change anything until we can accept what's real. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time. Once we accept what's real, we can diagnose a problem, we can come up with a solution, we can put our energies into moving towards solution. But if we can't acknowledge it, if we can't talk about it, then we'll get nowhere. And so we suppress, we do our addictions, we plow ahead with an inauthentic smile, and our leadership becomes inauthentic and less effective. So we work on healthy boundaries, conflict management, expressing ourselves appropriately, and relaxing. We get that adrenaline reducing activities rather than increasing activities. So that all involves knowing yourself. I'm a high D, I'm a dominant driver, I'm a high energy person, I'm an introvert, I'm a visionary. So I know, if I know myself, those are just ways that we have training on this earlier in the sequence. Those are ways that I can think about me, which could lead to self-understanding and then strategies, building teams with people different than me, listening to people with different perspectives so I get different input. I know that I need to be active. I need to exercise, and that takes time. I know I need enough rest. So as you know you, and you know what makes you tick, what rejuvenates you, and you then apply that to your Sabbath so it's real, and you're taking care of the various things I've got here, your physical health, your social networks. And the last thing is actually a preventative, even for, not everybody should be in ministry, not everybody should be an entrepreneur, not everybody should be a CEO. And you really do have the old thing called the Peter principle, where you rise to your highest level of dysfunction. That's very real. And so helping people find their fit from the beginning certainly prevents a lot of this stuff. So these are just some things from, these are kind of sidebars from the study at Duke that my friend Chris Adams, who's on the team, was sharing with me several years ago. Anger is a big deal. Something I tell all leaders are, you need to understand your anger and your anxiety. And if you understand your anger and your anxiety, it will help you with your addictions, and your leadership will be golden. You'll be on top of everything all the time, because they go together. It's the 3 A's: addiction, anxiety, and anger. So part of that is accepting some things, accepting the limits of our influence, accepting being able to be tolerant of others rather than reactive all the time. We have to define the limits of our influence. That's a phrase that I use a lot. The limits of my influence. What am I called to do? What is God's place? Where does my influence end? And when we figure that out, for example, as a therapist, I have people coming in all the time with heartrending stories and terrible circumstances. I have people that are suicidal that leave my office, and I have had to figure out how successful counseling is doing the very best I can do for 45 minutes. What they do with that is out of my control. And each of you in your role has to have that some way of thinking about that. My job is to preach the very best I can preach for 35 minutes on a Sunday morning, and that's the best I can do. What God does with that is outside of my control. Things like that to help us have realistic expectations. And social support is the biggest buffer against stress. All of us have a tendency to pull back if we are not feeling well, if we are not doing well in some area, and that's when we need people the most. So, I guess I pulled this from another handout. Sorry about all this. We're going to have to hear some kind of audio stuff. All right. Is there one more? Yeah. So these are just characteristics that are worth looking at and asking self, okay, how am I doing with this? And as I was reviewing this content for today's presentation, I read these things and realized it has taken me decades of work to be able to get to where, and it's work to keep it all going. So accepting myself, knowing my strengths and weaknesses, and accepting that for a perfectionist like me is hard work. I tend to be a planner, And when I'm anxious, I get kind of rigid and cold. People are always telling me to loosen up. I'm much more fun when I'm spontaneous, but I have to manage my anxiety to do that. It's all work. To be authentic, to actually trust people, uh, and to the point to where you can share of yourself. All these things I've had to work on, and I suspect that some of you do too. And over 6 decades, God has been very gracious. I've made great progress, but I still find work to do all the time. And so this is just sort of a checklist that I find useful to look at. A quick overview of, all right, so what are the things that help us be resilient? And this concept of resilience is very important. It has to do with a person going into stress who has high resilience is going to come out better than a person who goes into a stressful situation with low resilience. It's the ability to bounce back. That's what resilience is. A lot of these constructs come from physics. Stress and cracking, those are physical kinds of metaphors. Resilience as well, to spring back, to bounce back. So a rubber ball is resilient. I squeeze it and it bounces back. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with perception. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as competent? Do you see yourself as able to stress back? Do you expect to stress back? That relates to self-esteem. Trust relates to our ability to connect with others, to have faith, trust in God, trust in others, trust in self. Resourcefulness has to do with what we've learned, what we know, the tools we have. Do I see myself as self-efficacy has to do with the perception of competence and expectation of success. And internal locus of control is something I studied years ago when I was doing my dissertation on stress. And it's the idea, it's the concept, what influences the outcome? Internal means I do, external means it's outside of my capacity to influence. And generally speaking, where we see ourselves as able to influence the outcome, we do better, we feel better. My doctoral research was on working with nurses and in a medical center environment where there is death and there is loss and there are negative outcomes. And I was studying locus of control. I created a stress scale and found that when it came to critical incidents, in terms of seeing the cause, it was better not to see oneself as the cause of patients' deaths. And so older, experienced nurses never, if they did good work, they didn't see themselves as guilty. Younger nurses tended to feel responsible. So there are times when it's actually good not to have an internal locus, but when it comes to just coping with stress, it's good to be able to see oneself and to have good relationships, a sense of humor. These are all things that are very, very important for resilience, and they can all be developed and learned. And so this is, again, I'm sort of giving you some lists and some checklists and stuff like that to kind of help. And the biggest one is social support, which, comes, for me, the biblical anchor is just a passage in Ecclesiastes 4, where we read about the farmer working in the field, and if he falls, no one can help him. But if two are working together, they can help each other, support each other, produce a better product, defend, keep each other warm. A cord of 3 strands, who can break it? So the question I ask myself pretty regularly is, am I staying close to my lifeline, my cord of 3 strands, 3 other individuals who intertwine in such a fashion that they provide a line of support for me? And then I also think the other way, am I providing myself? Because you and I are people of resource. We're people who are worth knowing. Am I allowing myself to be part of someone else's lifeline? Because where there is mutual support, then we have great relationship. And so social support isn't just knowing people, it's what's described here. Sense of belonging. Knowing. The ideal lifeline are people you know love you, are committed to you, who have wisdom and can be of great help in a time of trouble. So I want to show you something. Give me just a second here. Now, we didn't send this out, but we're going to. And it is right here. So I took from this book, this assessment. So it probably is not okay to just copy it, one of those deals, but they've never complained. So it's one of those things where you rate 3, 2, 1, 0 from frequently to almost never, and it's just a nice list. It's pretty long, And I did it yesterday. So it looks at, I'm just going to just show it to you. So it looks at physical self-care, eating, movement, uh, sexual activity, all kinds of things. It looks at psychological self-care. Do you take breaks? So here it gets into Sabbath. If you look at this, there's a lot of Sabbath stuff. Listening, reflection, um, reading, writing. Uh, there's boundary setting, saying no to extra responsibilities sometimes. One of my tenets that I've discovered is applicable to me, and I offered to you as a little freebie. Here's a little aside. Anytime someone asks me to do something, my first thought is, who else could do this? And if I come up with somebody, I say no, I'm not going to do it. My thinking is the higher, as you're perceived as a person of high capacity, people are going to ask lots of things from you. And so I get asked to do all kinds of things. Sometimes people even pull the God told me card. God told me you're supposed to do this or that. And my reply always is, I believe God could reveal that to me as well. Hasn't yet. Maybe the timing's not quite right in what you've been told. So I say no, even if I know the other party won't do it as well as me. And so here's where I've had to deal with my perfectionism, my overburdened sense of duty that comes from a long line of folks in both sides of my family. And the issue is, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing at all. It doesn't have to be done particularly perfectly. And someone else might be able to grow if I give them the opportunity rather than burden myself with all these responsibilities. So my first thought is, who else could do this? I then reply, no, why don't you ask so-and-so? Unless it really is something that no one else can do. Or so it seems to me. Then I believe I'm perceiving God's call. Okay, no one else really can do this. Yes, I will do this. So saying no a lot is sometimes very, very helpful. Emotional self-care and self-expression, expressions of self-care, spiritual self-care. And here's where I love the books that are really, really good about spiritual disciplines. Celebration of Disciplines, Spiritual Disciplines. We're looking at Dallas Willard, Richard Foster, people like that, and just really challenging myself to take the time to exercise them more. So as I did this, the relationship self-care. So when I was doing this myself, I found myself pretty strong in certain areas, okay in others, and quite frankly needing to boost a few things. So it's just useful to take a look at these things and be honest and assess yourself in that and say, okay, so God, are you asking me to spend a little more time here so that we end up with balance, which is a challenging word for busy people. What is the balance? Because we know as leaders, we are sometimes called to put ourselves at risk. We're often called to sacrifice, but there has to be a place where we draw the line so we don't burn out, so that we're fit and resilient enough to be able to be effective in our role. All very important things. So we're going to send this out to you so you get a chance to look at that. And I need to get this back up. I wanted to spend a few minutes focusing on we've been giving kind of general overview with lots of kind of things to think about, but in a role as a leader, both in my business, my ministry, your business, grief and loss are a constant in life. We can't avoid death and taxes, so there are just things that just are. So just a quick review of the 5 stages of grief, because if we understand it ourselves, if we have lived it ourselves, we can lead authentically. And in helping lead people through grief, there are simple rules. Understand it, help educate them, and give them freedom to express what they feel. That's it, those 3 things. If we understand it, we teach about it. So in my grief counseling, I tell people what they're likely to experience, not trying to pigeon them whole into, you have to experience this or a right or wrong way to grieve, just general expressions so that they're not shocked by the reality of what they have to go through. It's a process. So in denial, this happens all the time. Sometimes it's very brief. Did you hear that so-and-so died? Oh no, that's denial. And then the emotional, once denial is set aside, then there is sorrow or anger. My mother died of cancer. I was angry with the greed that led to the irresponsible and criminal behavior of a dry cleaner that dumped his chemicals into the groundwater that increased cancer in the community where my mother lived. And I feel that it's okay to be angry with greed. Um, I had to forgive the man, but I can certainly be angry with greed. So what we do with our feelings is a big part of the grief process. Bargaining, oh God, if you only would do this, or if I'd only done that. And finally acceptance, which, I'm not real happy my mother's not in my life, but I began to see life without her. I began to have a forward thought as to what life would be like. So she's the closest person to me. My wife and I are still alive. We're still healthy. One day, one of us will have to deal with that. The identity changing things. And so having experienced these 5 things yourself and being able to share authentically with people as they go through it, with this understanding that the size of the loss, and what that means is how much we have to adapt. So if you can reflect back to the Holmes Ray scale, 100 points for the death of a spouse. Economics, social changes, you suddenly realize, wow, there's not, if you're in certain circles, there's not a huge social group for the divorced uh, or the widowed. Everybody's in couples. I mean, that's the thing I hear all the time. All the ministries of the church are about couples and families. There's no place for me. So that's tough stuff. So the biggest stressors are identity changes in self or in how we define our marriage or our family. Death of a child is huge. It's an 80% predictor of divorce, to lose a child. And then changes in ministry. Economic changes, shifts in culture, people leaving, all of these things we have to do with ourselves. I was talking to a pastor just last week who was really struggling. It's a small church, and he had a couple families leave, which represented a big percentage of his congregation and close relationships. So we were talking about, is it okay to grieve? Is it okay to feel the way I feel? And what do I do with it? And so he and I had a great conversation about learning about his own. He was a relatively young man, so learning about grief, and then how to lead his congregation through it. Because in a small church, when somebody goes away, it affects everybody. Somebody gets sick, it affects everybody. In a large church, we have churches in America that are cities. It still affects the equivalent number of a small church. So you have congregations within congregations. You have a big church, and you have to minister to the congregation, quote unquote, that is affected by the loss. So I tell everybody it takes a year. You have to go through a year. So if you lose someone, you lose a friend, and not just death. They move away, they leave your organization, they relocate geographically. The closer they are, the more this is real. But you have an acute phase of 3 months where you feel things very intensely. And then life kind of goes on. But you have to be prepared that people don't know to provide support for a whole year. You have to be prepared for people to stop asking about your loss. You have to be prepared to kind of feel like you're winging it alone, and that's where your cord of 3 strands comes into play. So you have even a small church. Child dies. People are pouring love and affection and care for a couple weeks. And then the family feels abandoned. Unless strategic leadership within the church rallies a few people who are willing to commit to long-term care, long-term meaning a year. Because every time you get a birthday, a holiday, boy, does the grief flow. If it's people recovering from adultery, there are all kinds of anniversary reactions they don't anticipate. So there's adultery, we work for a year, but there is the date of discovery. There's the date of knowing that it ended. There's the date where you first decided to forgive. And you have to work through this stuff. And sometimes, the bigger the event, the more we have to adapt new habits. So cooking for 1 instead of 2, cooking for 4 instead of 5, shopping for fewer people, just lots of things that take place. And it takes a year, I tell people. Give yourself a year. So fortunately, we have a faith perspective. This is pertaining to stress in general, grief in particular. James 1 is a great verse. This is translated from the NIV. So consider it pure joy. It doesn't mean it automatically comes. It's an effort. I am to be obedient. I will consider with pure joy when I face trials. And and I know the outcome. That's a big part of a faith perspective. We know the end story. So I know I will grow. My faith will grow, and I will be tougher. What doesn't kill me will make me stronger. I absolutely believe that. My greatest lessons in life were learned in terrible times. 2 3 year periods where my own response to stress yielded clinical depression, clinical anxiety, um, severe. And yet, because I'm a fairly robust person, never missed a day of work, kept things rolling, but was miserable. Well, out of this comes a theology of grief, comes a theology of hope, of positive expectation, because I have grown the most in those periods of time as a man, as a leader, than at any other period of my life. So, very important lessons learned. Today, I'm able to speak with you authentically as an individual who doesn't often feel anxious. But I'm also an individual who used to feel anxious all the time, wasn't fully aware of it. Uh, so signs of it now, if I start observing that I'm getting irritable, I ask myself, okay, what are you reacting to? If I find myself beginning to withdraw, what are you reacting to? So going through these difficult things creates self-understanding of who we are and how we should best function and who to connect to so that we may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So the Beatitudes are really interesting. The first bunch seem kind of make sense. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Okay, that sort of makes sense. Blessed, loosely defined, is happy. So it's kind of like going back to consider it pure joy. So persecution. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That is a present verb, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So James, I pretty much get. Matthew 5, I'm still working on. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So we go to Hebrews 11, we see the crowd of witnesses, we have this sense of belonging to something bigger than us. That is all very important in terms of coping with stress, which is where you as leaders have such a responsibility to keep before the people that follow you the big picture. Let's not get lost here in the woods entirely. We need to get down on the one-on-one for grief. We also need to see the big picture, which is what David did in writing Psalms. To just read the complaining Psalms is a good exercise in the expression, effective expression of grief, because he writes in one psalm, "My bed is wet from my tears, my bones ache," and those are grief symptoms. And then but he always turns it around, and he begins reflecting on the character of God. He begins moving toward gratitude and a positive expectation, and that is effective movement through grief. And timing is important when you are leading somebody. You don't early on say, "Well, this is going to turn out fine." You have to join them when they're at, and then gently move their vision forward with positive expectation. So this comes directly from some of the websites of the Duke study on clergy and health initiative. So there's redundancy in this presentation because some things are worth saying more than once. So you can go through these questions yourself and just ask yourself, maybe if you have a spouse, go to your spouse and say, what do you think? Do I take time? Go to people that know you well. Do a self-assessment with input from others so you don't just fool yourself. And then strategize whether we should take action, right? These three questions, and there are more I'm going to show you, but these three questions in particular are great places to start, because that third one, what's worked for you in the past? I'm going to talk next month about intervening with people in critical stress. And what we do is we help them tell the story, understand the story, and then we mobilize their resources. And that's part of that question. So these three questions have to do with time, planning, following through, considering what worked. Now this is for pastors. And do you feel that your congregation supports you, yes or no? If not, that's a problem. Now, Do I expect everybody all the time to support me? No. But I have to work really hard to create a loving congregation that also loves its leader in order for that leader to be helpful. And so how do we assess this accurately? And is my leadership such that it moves people forward positively? That's a term you can search. What is a positive congregation? How can I lead people positively? We've all known churches that developed a negative character. The common phrase is, well, you tell me what we're voting on, I'm against it. Or, you propose something and you get an onslaught of reasons why, we can't do that, we can't do this. So these questions flow with evaluating, am I spending my time as leader helping develop community, people who are open to new experiences? And so there's this particular individual, you can search him and look at his work. And it's developing a congregation who's a team, rather than viewing them entirely as people who are dependent upon your leadership, dependent upon the ministry that the paid staff provide. They join us. When I was young, I've had some interesting experiences. So coming out of a conservative, evangelical, a holiness tradition, the Free Methodist Church, generations in my family, I attended a Free Methodist college and was asked by the chaplain to consider taking a job in a United Church of Christ in the local town outside where my college was. So I'm attending a conservative Christian college, and he asked me to go to a non-denominational church and take a job. He said, I think you could do it. They want someone from our school to lead their young people. And so I entered into a 3-year stint, and I was 19 when I started this. And the church is non-denominational. There were Unitarians, there were atheists, there were agnostics. I believe that their statement of faith was, we gather together in the Spirit of Christ to worship God as we know him. That's pretty vague. And what I found were young people who wanted to know God, but I was kind of hired to do it. And I was often frustrated. And the lead pastor was a giant of a man he always had a pipe in his mouth and a sarcastic comment to make. I liked him a lot. And so I was saying, Bob, parents don't want to be involved. And he said, well, Paul, you have to look at it this way. You and me are paid to do their loving. And he used a derogatory term in that mix. And he was right. I was in an environment where people expected the leadership to provide all of the spiritual direction, all of the care, all of the help. And I realized as a young man, this wasn't really very functional. And so, when I am looking at churches and guiding leaders and coaching teams, that's one of the facets we look at is what is the culture of involvement that we're creating with our people. And some of the churches in Romania have the most outstanding, relative to American churches, outstanding involvement of the congregants that I've seen anywhere in the world. Really some wonderful, wonderful examples of that. So we don't want to be doing all the heavy lifting ourselves. It'll break our backs. Just break our backs. So there's another thing I want to show you. You might not see the link with stress until you go through it. But let me pull this up real quick. And I love this exercise. And so it's creating capacity by cutting low-value activities. Nobody has enough time. And time management for a leader is really critical. When I first started doing private practice back in 1987, I was anxious about having enough people to see. I don't worry about that anymore. But I used to every day look at my calendar and see that it was busy the next day, look at my desk with work undone, and feel glad that I had something to do tomorrow. I had purpose, I had drive, and it became sort of a joke. I still do that as a joke, but believe me, there's plenty to do. So this is looking at, it's an exercise to help you evaluate these dimensions. The value it brings to you, the heart, the impact, how does this affect either my ministry or my family or others? Does it help me grow, or does it help my organization grow? And then the sense of obligation. And this is really nicely put together. So you rate, you create this chart, and I think I had I extended this space. I think I had 30 different things on there. I just thought through every day. I wrote it down, and then rated it on heart, impact, growth, and obligation. Then you add it up. And what I found was both. This was really pivotal for Becky and me. We did this together with our coach, who at the time was Tom Nolan, a good friend of mine. He's with Growth Mission. He's on my leadership team, and so we spent some time working on this kind of thing. And and Becky said, she looks at it and says, well, my list, I really need to cut back on FaceTime. I need to cut back on some of these things. And I looked at my list and I said, I got to cut back on counseling. And this was like gigantic epiphany kind of thing, because I was used to seeing one-on-one or in family groupings or couples, between 45 and 55 clients a week. Well, that's a lot of time. And I'm trying to run an organization, and I had a vision for doing some leadership development, and I was bogged down. And I went through periods of time of just kind of feeling burned out with it. So it happened to be God speaking through this exercise, and I began conceptualizing, how could I possibly cut back on counseling? So one method was, I'll only see leaders. So my new clientele from that point on, which has been going on 5 years now, was only leaders. And they often have the capacity to, if once they decide they're going to make a change, they often can, which was really refreshing and fun. So I can see quite a few new leaders in my schedule. Right now I actively see about 12 a week. But what has evolved has been really fun. It opened the door for me to do more work that is short term. So I do these assessments, which has increased my capacity to train students to do it. So I'm spending much more time in small teams than just by myself. The result is I'm happier, way, way happier. And so this exercise was really, really pivotal for me. And every leader I have taken comes back and says, okay, I'm really seeing some patterns here. So it's a simple concept, right? We look at what we do. So I had, personal grooming, watching television, driving to work, some things that, drive to work, obligation, high, hard impact growth, low. But then I began thinking, how can I use that time better? How can I make it have more heart? And so I began listening to things that were different than I was listening to, that sort of thing. So I recommend you do it. We're going to send this out to you. Take the time to fill it out. And then it's got some action steps down at the bottom. I highly recommend you do this with somebody, this kind of thing, because sometimes we fool ourselves or we minimize things. So Becky and I did this together. We discussed each other's. We stimulated positive discussion, brainstorming. We were doing this with a coach. That's a great concept. Three voices helping each other, encouraging each other. So that I highly recommend. So that's, am I prioritizing well? Robust people who are authentic know what they're about, and they strategically pursue those things really well. Okay, resources. What I have here, and you can take a screenshot if you want, or you can just grab this later. The Divinity School at Duke, these are specific sites from which I gathered information in this website, and they provide links all over the place. I mean, you could spend hours and hours studying this, which is well worth your time. The more you know about stress, about your own health, the better off you'll be. So some of our resources, and I put this here for anyone who may view this online to educate them, but also to refresh your memory. That first website is from the National Institute of Health, and that's the one I was referencing on a previous slide. The rest are things that we do. We provide coaching and counseling. I have a team. We have a four-person team that'll tackle an organization, with one of us or more of us traveling to the site and building relationship, and then coaching and doing online stuff. I've always got somebody in the hopper I'm working with. Right now I'm having a lot of fun with a group from Ohio. We bring leaders here for anywhere from 3 to 21 days. We can house them at no cost. I can provide local transportation if they can get here. And we have a team that works with leaders for personal restoration, marital restoration. We've done a couple cases of prevention. Those are rare. Would love to see more of that. And then we have this training every third Thursday of the month. We've only really canceled a few, usually because of holiday, way they hit holidays or something. And I'm going through a series called Lead Like the Good Shepherd, which if you search YouTube, you can find. And then welcome others to join us. Forward your colleagues and friends to Mirabella V. That's Mirabella, my good friend and colleague in Romania who handles a lot of my communication, and she can help coordinate communication with me. Or you can always reach out to me directly at pvanvalin@edencounseling.com. But when it comes to like registering things, that's more Mirabella. So, in your journey, in our journey together, uh, take a look at these things. Go do some online stuff. Um, take time uh, to ponder. Keep a Sabbath, and then feel free to just shoot me an email. pvanvalin@edencounseling.com. You have a question, you have a thought, you have a suggestion, you have a resource you think I should share. All that's great stuff. So, thank you all for joining me this close to the in between holidays. We're all paying for our holidays. We'll be back in January, the third Thursday at noon. Topic is critical stress. We're going to get into these kind of more dramatic things. Um, and there are plenty of biblical references, examples, and in my own work and career are full of them. So that's going to be a fun session. So I'll see you then. God bless. Have a great Christmas. And we're looking forward to 2017 with eager anticipation. You all take care. Bye-bye.